There are stories hidden in plantation records that were never meant to be read aloud, names written once, then never again, permissions granted without explanation, doors opened in the middle of the night and never questioned. Tonight's story is about a man who was enslaved by law, yet walked freely through white households after dark. No chains followed him, no overseer stopped him, and no plantation owner ever admitted why. This is the story of the slave who could enter any house at night, and the terrible reason no one dared to refuse him. Before we get started, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss a chilling story. In the low country of the American South, where the air itself seemed heavy with secrets, and the land stretched outward in long obedient rows of cotton and cane, night was never meant to belong to the enslaved. Darkness was feared by the masters, regulated by patrols, guarded by dogs, and enforced by law. After sundown, every enslaved body was expected to remain where it had been placed, silent and contained, because movement at night suggested conspiracy, escape, or violence. Lanterns swung slowly along plantation roads. Overseers counted bodies twice, and doors were locked not just against intrusion but against imagination itself. Yet within this rigid world of control, there existed a single inexplicable exception, one man whose footsteps were heard long after curfew bells had faded, a man whose silhouette passed through moonlit yards without challenge, a man who approached front doors instead of back entrances and was never turned away. His name, when it appeared at all, was Elias, though sometimes he was not named at all, referred to only as the Night Man or him, as if writing the name itself carried danger. He was enslaved by law, owned on paper, counted as property in ledgers that valued him no more than a mule, and yet he moved through white households with a quiet authority that no overseer questioned. This was not privilege granted by kindness, nor was it freedom disguised as trust. It was something far more unsettling. Elias did not run. He did not resist openly. He did not preach, organize, or raise his voice. Instead, he walked calmly through the spaces forbidden to him, his presence accepted not because he was harmless, but because he was necessary. Plantation owners who would whip a man for lifting his eyes too high would pause when Elias appeared at their door after midnight. Wives who would not allow an enslaved woman into the parlor during the day allowed Elias to sit by the fire at night. Even patrols, men paid specifically to hunt down unauthorized movement, looked the other way when they saw him pass, as if they had been instructed without ever being told. There were no written permissions that allowed this, no passes bearing his name, no laws explaining why he could do what others could not. And that silence is where the truth begins. Systems built on domination do not create exceptions unless the cost of enforcement becomes greater than the cost of disobedience. Elias had been born on the same soil he would later walk so freely, raised among fields and fences, taught early that survival depended not on strength but on observation. From a young age he learned to listen more than he spoke, to notice patterns in people who believed themselves unobserved, to remember details others dismissed as unimportant. He worked first in the yards, then indoors, repairing locks, carrying messages, cleaning offices, and arranging papers that were never meant for him to read, though read them he did, silently, carefully, committing names, numbers, and contradictions to memory. He saw how plantation owners spoke differently in public than they did in private, how morality shifted behind closed doors, how reputations were constructed like fragile houses that could collapse if one B.M. were removed. Over years, Elias became invisible in the most dangerous way, not unseen, but underestimated. By the time night first opened its doors to him, he already knew more than anyone realized. The first time he walked freely after dark was not recorded as a moment of rebellion or courage, it was recorded as a problem being handled. A planter's household faced a situation that threatened exposure, one that could not be solved with money alone and could not survive daylight scrutiny. Elias was sent for quietly, urgently, and when he arrived, Whatever he said or did resolved the matter so completely that no further explanation was required. From that night forward, he was no longer just an enslaved man. He was a contingency, a solution, a safeguard against disgrace. And once one household made use of him, others followed, not by recommendation but by desperation, as rumors traveled in the way secrets always do. Carefully, indirectly, cloaked in implication, Elias never advertised his role, never demanded compensation, never spoke of what he knew. His power did not come from threats, but from the understanding that he could destroy without lifting a hand, simply by remembering aloud what others prayed would remain buried. That was why no one ever stopped him at night. To stop him would require asking why he was there, and asking why would invite answers no one could afford. In a society obsessed with control, Elias represented something far more frightening than resistance. He represented awareness. Before we continue deeper into this story, into how that awareness spread like a shadow across entire plantations, take a moment to subscribe to Born into Darkness, hit the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next, and leave a comment telling me how this story is making you feel so far, because the truths history tried hardest to hide are the ones that matter most, and what Elias became after this moment would quietly reshape the balance of power in ways no law ever acknowledged. By the time Elias's name became a whisper passed carefully between plantation households, the structure of Southern nights had already begun to change in subtle, almost invisible ways, because power does not always announce itself with violence or command. It often arrives as routine. What made Elias dangerous was not that he moved at night, but that his movements slowly became expected, even relied upon, until the idea of stopping him felt more disruptive than letting him pass. After that first night, when a household crisis had been quietly neutralized, word traveled through channels that polite society pretended did not exist, over brandy poured too generously, through letters written in careful half-sentences during long pauses at church gatherings, where one woman would study another's face and know exactly what question not to ask. Elias became a figure associated not with scandal, but with the prevention of it. He was sent for when a young heir had wandered somewhere he should not have, when documents had disappeared from a desk and reappeared in the wrong hands, when a servant had seen too much, heard too much, or threatened, intentionally or not, to let the truth slip. Elias handled these matters with an unsettling calm. He did not lecture, did not accuse, did not beg. He listened, he observed, and he remembered. That memory was his currency. He learned quickly that white households were not unified structures of authority, but fragile ecosystems held together by fear of exposure. Husbands feared wives, wives feared society, sons feared inheritance, daughters feared marriage markets, and everyone feared rumor more than law. Elias understood that fear intimately because it mirrored his own condition. Enslaved people lived under the constant threat of punishment, but also under the knowledge that punishment itself depended on silence. Masters needed the world to believe in order, propriety, and control, and Elias existed at the precise intersection that belief could fracture. As he moved from house to house under cover of darkness, he absorbed not only information but contradictions. Men who preached discipline yet relied on secrecy, women who enforced cruelty by day yet pleaded for discretion by night, overseers who beat bodies in the fields but trembled when Elias looked at them too long. He never challenged authority directly, because direct confrontation invited resistance. Instead, he positioned himself as inevitable. When someone asked why he had been allowed entry, the answer was always vague. He was sent for, or he needed to handle something, and those answers were never questioned, because questioning them required confronting the very disorder Elias existed to manage. Plantation patrols noticed him early on, of course. A man walking unescorted at night was exactly what they were trained to stop, but the first time one tried, the correction came swiftly and quietly from above. Not a written reprimand, not a public shaming, just a word dropped in the right ear that some people were not to be interfered with. No explanation followed. And in the South, lack of explanation often carried more weight than command. Elias understood then that he was protected not by benevolence, but by shared vulnerability. Each household that used his services became complicit in his continued movement. To stop him would be to expose themselves. Over time, his role expanded beyond crisis management into something more abstract and more powerful: mediation. He was asked to deliver messages that could not be written, to retrieve items that could not be openly sought, to confirm rumors without repeating them aloud. He became the connective tissue between isolated worlds that pretended they had nothing to hide. And yet, for all this movement, all this access, Elias never forgot what he was under the law. He slept where he was told. He worked where he was assigned. His body still bore the weight of ownership. That tension, the gap between how he was treated at night and how he was treated by day, sharpened his awareness rather than confusing it. He saw clearly that his usefulness did not equal safety, that one mistake could collapse the fragile arrangement that allowed him to exist between worlds. So he moved carefully, never overstaying, never speaking more than necessary, never demanding recognition. His power lay in restraint. What terrified the masters most was not that Elias knew their secrets, but that he did not seem eager to use them. That restraint made him unpredictable. Was he loyal? Was he dangerous? Did he serve out of obligation, ambition, or something else entirely? No one could say, and that uncertainty gnawed at people accustomed to certainty. The children of these households noticed him too. They saw how adults changed when Elias entered a room, how voices softened, how authority wavered. To them, he became a figure of quiet mystery, someone who existed outside the rules they were being taught. Some watched him with fear, others with curiosity, but all understood instinctively that he was not like other enslaved men. Not safe to dismiss. And so Elias continued, night after night, house after house, weaving himself into the unspoken infrastructure of plantation life, until the idea of a southern night without him felt incomplete, even dangerous. What no one realized, what no one dared consider, was that every step Elias took was not just movement, but accumulation, not just service, but preparation, because memory, once full enough, becomes leverage, and leverage, once understood, becomes choice. As Elias's nightly presence hardened into an unspoken institution, something subtler began to shift beneath the surface of plantation life, something even more dangerous than rumor or scandal: the slow erosion of certainty. Masters believed themselves architects of order, yet Elias now moved through that order like a living contradiction, revealing how much of it relied not on law or force, but on mutual silence. He began to understand that the night did not merely hide things, it rearranged them. In darkness, hierarchies softened, voices lowered, and truths escaped their cages. Listened as wives confessed fears they would never speak in daylight, as sons admitted debts, addictions, and crimes quietly smoothed over by family name, as overseers begged for intervention to save themselves from punishments meant for others. Each confession was offered not with trust, but with desperation, and Elias learned to recognize desperation as the purest form of honesty. He catalogued everything, not in writing, never in writing, but in memory, associating each secret with faces, hallways, creaking staircases, and the subtle smells of each house. He noticed patterns, too, how certain families depended on others, how marriages were less about affection and more about insulation against exposure, how business partnerships survived not on profit alone, but on shared guilt. The more Elias observed, the clearer it became that the system enslaving him was itself enslaved to appearances. By day, plantation owners spoke confidently of God-ordained hierarchy, yet by night they bargained like frightened men guarding fragile glass structures. Elias began to realize that his role was no longer reactive. He was no longer simply summoned. Sometimes he anticipated need before it was voiced. He would arrive with a message already composed, a solution already implied, and the households would accept it because the alternative, hesitation, felt too risky. This anticipation made him even more unsettling. It suggested not obedience but insight, and insight, in a society built on denial, was profoundly threatening. Yet no one challenged him openly, because each household assumed the others had granted him authority. This diffusion of responsibility protected Elias better than any single patron ever could. Meanwhile, The patrols that once scanned the roads aggressively began to recognize his silhouette without truly seeing him. Familiarity dulled suspicion. They told themselves he belonged somewhere, even if they could not say where. Elias understood that invisibility was not about being unseen, it was about being seen so often that no one asked why. Still, the cost of this liminal existence pressed heavily on him. He watched other enslaved men punished for lesser freedoms, their movements restricted, their bodies broken, and he knew that his exception rested on a knife's edge. He could not rescue them openly. Any display of solidarity risked collapsing the fragile illusion that made him useful. This restraint carved a hollow inside him, a space filled with anger he dared not express. But that anger did not rot, it refined. He began to imagine not escape in the traditional sense, but destabilization. If the system depended on silence, then sound, carefully timed, selectively released, could unmake it. He did not rush this thought. Rushed actions were visible. Patience, on the other hand, blended perfectly with night. As months passed, Elias began to notice how often households contradicted one another in their expectations of him. One demanded loyalty, another discretion, another speed, another mercy. These contradictions were not burdens, they were fractures. Elias learned to stand precisely within them, offering just enough to satisfy each party without ever fully aligning himself. This positioning gave him something rare among the enslaved: choice. Not absolute freedom, but the ability to decide which path to walk on a given night, which door to knock on first, which message to delay. Small choices, invisible choices, but choices nonetheless. And with each choice came consequence, rippling quietly through social networks that believed themselves static. A delayed message could sour a negotiation. A timely word could avert violence. Elias discovered that he could redirect outcomes without ever appearing responsible for them. This realization changed how he saw himself. He was no longer merely enduring history, he was nudging it. The children, who once watched him with curiosity, now watched with something closer to awe, sensing that he moved through spaces forbidden even to them. Some asked questions he could not answer, others learned to stay silent, absorbing lessons their parents never intended to teach. And all the while, Elias kept walking, night after night, the roads between plantations growing as familiar as the paths of his own thoughts. He knew that the deeper he embedded himself, the harder he would be to remove, but also the greater the collapse would be if he ever chose to step aside. That knowledge sat with him like a coiled spring. The night had given him access, memory, and leverage. What it had not yet given him was resolution. But Elias felt it coming, the way one feels a storm before the sky darkens, a pressure change in the air, a tightening in the chest. The system that had learned to depend on him was teaching him exactly how to dismantle it, one quiet step at a time. By the time Elias understood that the storm he sensed was not coming from outside but forming within the very structure that depended on him, his nights had taken on a different weight, each step carrying consequence beyond the immediate errand. He began to notice how often his presence delayed decisions, how families waited for his return before acting, as if his footsteps stitched the hours together into something navigable. And this reliance deepened quietly, dangerously. Plantation owners who once prided themselves on self-sufficiency now found their confidence thinning in the dark, their authority less convincing when stripped of daylight witnesses. Elias saw it in the way doors opened faster, in the way voices dropped before he even crossed the threshold, in the way hands trembled as papers were passed to him for delivery. He was no longer just a messenger, he was a witness, and witnessing in a world built on denial was a form of power no one wanted to name. As he moved from house to house, Elias began to feel the tension between what was said and what was meant, between orders given and hopes unspoken. Some masters asked him to deliver threats, but secretly wished reconciliation. Others demanded secrecy, while leaving clues meant to be discovered. Elias learned to read these contradictions as maps, guiding him through the moral fog of the night. He realized that the system's greatest weakness was not cruelty, it was dependence. Each plantation believed itself isolated, sovereign, yet Elias knew better. He had seen how debts intertwined families, how marriages masked financial desperation, how reputations were propped up by favors exchanged in whispers. And at the center of this web moved one man who belonged fully to none of it, yet touched all of it. This awareness did not bring him peace. It sharpened his isolation. He could not speak openly of what he knew, could not share the burden with those who labored beside him by day, because knowledge itself had become dangerous. He watched friends beaten for infractions he could have prevented if only he were allowed to intervene, and each time he swallowed his words, he felt the system tightening around his throat. Still, he endured, because endurance had taught him something crucial. Timing mattered more than intent. A secret revealed too soon became noise. Revealed at the right moment, it became rupture. Elias began to test this quietly, not out of malice but necessity. He delayed a message here, hastened another there, and watched as outcomes shifted subtly but unmistakably. A business deal collapsed because a warning arrived too late. A duel was avoided because a confession reached the right ears in time. No one traced these changes back to him because no one wanted to believe that an enslaved man could alter the course of white men's decisions. That disbelief was his shield. Yet the more he exercised this influence, the more precarious his position became. Rumors began to circulate, not accusations but questions. How did Elias know so much? Why was he trusted with such sensitive matters? Why did he seem to appear precisely when needed? These questions were never asked directly, only floated in the air like smoke, but Elias felt them brushing against him as he passed. He responded by becoming even more careful, more measured, ensuring that his presence never lingered longer than necessary, that his eyes never lingered where they should not. He understood that survival now depended not just on obedience, but on performance, the performance of harmlessness. At the same time, something else was changing. The enslaved community began to notice his movements, his unusual freedom, the way overseers hesitated before stopping him. Some looked at him with hope, others with suspicion, and Elias knew both reactions were dangerous. Hope could lead to expectation, and expectation could lead to exposure. He offered what help he could in fragments, quiet warnings, subtle redirections, advice given as coincidence, but never promises. He could not afford to become a symbol. Symbols were hunted. Instead, he remained a shadow, useful precisely because he was undefined. And yet, internally, his resolve was solidifying. He no longer imagined freedom as a destination beyond the plantation gates. He imagined it as a collapse inward, a moment when the structures that defined him as property would fail under their own contradictions. Each night reinforced this vision. He saw masters argue with their wives over secrets only Elias knew in full. He watched sons inherit estates already rotting with undisclosed debts. He listened as ministers preached order by day and begged for discretion by night. The hypocrisy was not abstract, it was intimate, spoken inches from his face, entrusted to him because those who spoke believed him incapable of judgment. That belief was their fatal error. Elias judged everything, not with moral outrage alone, but with strategic clarity. He understood that the system's survival depended on the illusion that it was natural, inevitable, divinely sanctioned. But nothing natural required so much secrecy to maintain. As the months wore on, Elias began to sense a convergence, a moment when too many secrets intersected, when too many families relied on the same fragile arrangements. He did not know exactly when or how the rupture would occur, only that it was approaching. The storm was no longer distant. It was pressing against the walls of every house he entered, vibrating in the floorboards beneath his feet. He felt it in his own body too, in the way his sleep grew shallow, his dreams crowded with doors that would not close. Yet he did not retreat. Retreat would have meant surrendering the only leverage he had ever known. So he kept walking, night after night, carrying messages that were never just messages, moving through a world that believed itself stable while quietly leaning on him to remain so. And with every step, Elias understood more clearly that when the storm finally broke, it would not announce itself with thunder. It would arrive as silence, messages undelivered, doors unopened, expectations unmet, and in that silence, the truth the night had been hiding would finally be forced into the light. The silence Elias had begun to imagine was not empty but dense, packed with withheld actions and unspoken realizations, and as it crept closer, he found himself moving through the nights with a heightened awareness that bordered on premonition, every sound carrying layered meanings, every pause an opportunity or a threat. Plantation owners, once confident in the routines that governed their lives, started to show cracks that only someone like Elias could see, cracks that widened after sunset when authority lost its audience and fear became personal. He noticed how lanterns were lit earlier now, how doors were double-checked, how conversations that once spilled freely into the night were cut short when his shadow appeared at the edge of a porch. They still sent for him, still relied on his movement to connect their scattered worlds, but the trust had become anxious, edged with the faintest suspicion that something had shifted beyond their control. Elias felt this change most acutely in the way he was watched, not openly, not with confrontation, but with glances that lingered a second too long, with questions framed as casual curiosity. He answered them with the same calm he always had, his voice steady, his posture deferential, but inside he was cataloguing everything, weighing each interaction against the growing sense that the system was beginning to notice its own dependence. At the same time, the flow of secrets intensified, as if sensing the fragility of their positions. The powerful began to offload more of their burdens onto the night, trusting Elias with confessions that were heavier than any package he carried. He heard of forged land deeds hidden in false bottoms of desks, of illegitimate children sent north under assumed names, of bribes paid to sheriffs and judges alike to keep certain deaths classified as accidents. These were not the stories told to shock. They were told because the tellers needed someone to know, someone who would carry the knowledge without challenging them, and Elias did exactly that, storing each detail with careful neutrality. But neutrality did not mean inaction. He had begun to understand the rhythm of cause and effect in this world, how a single delay could ripple outward, how a whisper planted in the right place could bloom into doubt that no amount of authority could fully suppress. He used this understanding sparingly, almost reluctantly, because each intervention increased the risk, yet the pressure to act grew as he saw the consequences of inaction accumulate. Enslaved families were sold off to cover debts he knew about before they were announced. Men were punished for crimes that served as convenient distractions from scandals Elias had overheard. The night no longer felt like a refuge, it felt like a crossroads where every choice carried moral weight. In response, Elias refined his methods, becoming less visible even as his influence deepened. He learned to pass information indirectly, allowing others to believe they had discovered truths on their own. A ledger left slightly out of place, a comment dropped where it would be overheard, a message delivered to a household already primed for conflict. These were small acts, almost invisible, yet their cumulative effect was unmistakable. Houses that once hosted lavish gatherings grew quiet as alliances frayed. Men who had dominated local councils found their decisions challenged by whispers they could not trace. No one accused Elias because no one could imagine him as the source, and because doing so would require admitting that the carefully enforced boundaries of power had been breached. Still, the tension bled into his own life. Overseers began assigning him different routes without explanation, as if testing whether his reach depended on familiarity. Guards lingered longer at gatehouses, asking him to wait while they checked papers he had carried unchallenged for years. These were subtle shifts, but Elias recognized them as signs that the system was probing its own edges, trying to locate the point of vulnerability without acknowledging its nature. He responded by adjusting again, never resisting directly, always complying just enough to appear unaffected, while quietly mapping the new constraints. Each change taught him more about the fears driving them, and fear, he knew, was information. Among the enslaved, the atmosphere shifted as well. Word spread that something was changing, though few could articulate what. Some sensed opportunity, others braced for backlash. Elias became a figure of quiet speculation, his nightly movements inspiring rumors that ranged from admiration to distress. He avoided addressing these directly, understanding that clarity could be dangerous. Instead, he focused on protecting what little stability he could, steering trouble away when possible, warning those at risk without exposing himself. The burden of this dual existence weighed on him, pressing down in moments of solitude when the night offered no distractions. He questioned whether his actions were enough, whether they mattered in a system so vast and entrenched, and yet each time he considered retreating into simple survival, another confession or injustice pulled him back into engagement. The world would not let him be neutral, and he was beginning to accept that neither could he. The nights grew longer, or perhaps his awareness stretched them, filling the hours with observation and calculation. He noticed patterns emerging, a convergence of interests among a small group of powerful families whose secrets overlapped in dangerous ways. Their reliance on Elias was not coincidental, it was structural, the result of a network so tangled that it required a trusted intermediary to function at all. Elias realized that if this network were disrupted at the right moment, the collapse would not be contained. It would spread outward, implicating those who believed themselves insulated by distance or status. This realization frightened him, not because of the danger to himself, he had long accepted that risk, but because of the unpredictable fallout. Innocent people would be caught in the shockwaves, enslaved and free alike, and Elias wrestled with the ethics of triggering a collapse he could not fully control. Yet the alternative, maintaining a system that consumed lives quietly and continuously, seemed no less cruel. As this internal conflict intensified, external pressure mounted. One night, he was summoned to a house where the atmosphere was thick with accusation, where a master's voice trembled with barely contained rage as he demanded explanations for rumors that had begun to circulate. Elias listened, nodded, reassured, and left with the familiar weight of being the repository for fears that could not be voiced elsewhere. But as he walked away, he sensed that the window of invisibility was narrowing. The storm he had anticipated was no longer abstract, it was forming shapes, aligning interests, drawing attention. He knew that whatever came next would require more than subtlety. The night was teaching him its final lesson, that silence could destabilize as effectively as speech, and that absence could be as powerful as presence. As he disappeared into the darkness once more, Elias carried not just messages, but a decision still forming, a recognition that the role he had been forced into was approaching its limit. The system had leaned on him for too long, and when it finally lost its balance, it would not be because he shouted or rebelled openly, but because he stepped aside at precisely the wrong moment, allowing the carefully maintained illusion of control to collapse under the weight of its own secrets. By the time Elias understood that stepping aside could be as disruptive as action, the night itself seemed to respond, thickening around him as if aware that something irrevocable was approaching, and he began to move with a deliberateness that felt less like caution and more like ritual. Each journey through the dark now measured not by distance but by consequence. The plantations he crossed no longer felt like separate domains, but like chambers in one vast organism, connected by veins of fear and dependency that pulsed most visibly after sunset, and Elias, who had once believed himself merely a messenger moving between them, now saw that he had been functioning as a nerve, transmitting signals that allowed the whole to coordinate and survive. Removing himself, even partially, would not create immediate chaos. Instead, it would introduce delay, misinterpretation, and silence where clarity had existed, and Elias understood that. Systems built on secrecy could not tolerate ambiguity for long. He tested this knowledge carefully at first, arriving minutes late to a delivery here, omitting a minor detail there, watching how quickly irritation blossomed into suspicion, how small misunderstandings escalated when there was no trusted intermediary to resolve them. Plantation owners who had never spoken directly to one another found themselves forced into uncomfortable conversations, revealing fractures that Elias had long observed from the shadows. Old rivalries resurfaced, fueled by the absence of the buffer he had unknowingly provided, and alliances that depended on quiet coordination began to fray. Elias listened as accusations multiplied, each party convinced that betrayal had occurred, yet unable to identify its source, and he felt a grim clarity settle over him as he realized that the system's greatest vulnerability was not rebellion but exposure. forcing the powerful to confront one another without the insulation of controlled secrecy. At the same time, his own existence grew more precarious. The privileges that had once shielded him, unquestioned movement, assumed loyalty, became liabilities as scrutiny intensified. Overseers followed him longer with their eyes, guards asked for confirmation that never came, and whispers about his unusual access circulated with increasing boldness. Elias responded not with defiance but with a calculated withdrawal, making himself less useful while appearing unchanged, a balance that required constant adjustment. He began declining certain tasks under plausible pretexts, citing illness or conflicting orders, and each refusal sent ripples through the network, forcing those accustomed to delegation to confront the logistics of their own complicity. Meanwhile, the enslaved community sensed the shift more acutely than the masters did, reading the signs in altered routines and rising tensions, and Elias found himself approached in hushed tones, asked whether something was coming, whether danger or opportunity lay ahead. He could not answer them honestly without placing them at risk, so he offered instead what guidance he could, urging caution, preparedness, and mutual awareness, planting the idea that survival might soon depend less on obedience and more on solidarity. This quiet encouragement weighed on him heavily, because he knew that any upheaval would exact its harshest price from those with the least protection, yet he also knew that the status quo was a slow violence that consumed them regardless. As the nights passed, events began to accelerate in ways even Elias had not fully anticipated. A delayed message led to a missed payment, which exposed a hidden debt, which in turn forced a land sale that revealed falsified records, and suddenly, a family that had seemed untouchable was scrambling to contain a scandal that threatened to drag others down with it. Elias observed this cascade from a distance, both horrified and vindicated, recognizing the pattern he had sensed taking shape, now manifesting openly. The masters responded predictably, tightening control where they could, increasing punishments, imposing curfews, attempting to reassert dominance through visible cruelty. But these actions only deepened the unrest, making their fear palpable and their authority brittle. Elias felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him, knowing that his choices had contributed to this moment. Yet he also felt a strange calm, a sense that the trajectory had become larger than any single person's intent. He moved through the chaos like a ghost, present but ungraspable, absorbing information without redistributing it, letting silence do its work. This withdrawal forced others to speak more than they wished, to act without guidance, and in doing so, they exposed the mechanisms they had long hidden behind tradition and routine. One night, as Elias passed near a grand house that had once welcomed him freely, he overheard a heated argument. Spilling out through an open window, voices raised in desperation as former allies accused one another of betrayal, and he realized that the illusion of unity that had sustained them was dissolving. The knowledge he carried was no longer concentrated. It was leaking into the open, manifesting as rumor, conflict, and mistrust, and there was no way to gather it back. Yet this unraveling came at a cost that Elias felt keenly. Retaliation followed uncertainty, and when control slipped, the powerful struck downward, punishing those they could reach to reassure themselves of their dominance. Elias witnessed scenes of suffering that tested his resolve, moments when he questioned whether the collapse he was enabling would ultimately improve anything at all. In these moments, he clung to the understanding that systems built on exploitation rarely dismantle cleanly, that progress, if it came, would arrive unevenly and with scars, and that his role was not to engineer an outcome, but to refuse participation in the machinery of oppression. As pressure mounted, Elias prepared for the possibility that his invisibility would fail entirely. He memorized escape routes, established contingencies, and quietly ensured that certain truths were already beyond his control, passed on in fragments that could not be traced back to him. The night, once a space of movement and access, became a crucible in which every step carried existential weight, and Elias moved through it with the awareness that the end of his unique position was inevitable. He did not know whether he would survive what came next, whether he would be punished, sold, or erased, but he understood that the system he had served without choice would never again function as it once had. As dawn approached on one particularly tense morning, Elias paused at the edge of a field, listening to the distant sounds of a world straining under its own contradictions, and felt a profound, unsettling certainty settle within him. Whatever followed would not restore balance, but it would reveal truth. And in that revelation lay the only form of justice this broken world could offer. As the fragile equilibrium finally shattered, Elias found that the night no longer merely concealed him but actively resisted him, every shadow seeming sharper, every sound amplified by a collective anxiety that had spread across the plantations, like a low fever, and where once he moved unquestioned, he now felt the land itself holding its breath as if waiting to see whether he would be exposed or erased. The unraveling he had set in motion was no longer subtle or deniable. It had reached a stage where even the most insulated plantation owners could not pretend that something fundamental had gone wrong, and their response, driven by fear rather than foresight, was to search desperately for a culprit rather than confront the system they had built. Meetings were called in hurried secrecy, men who once trusted Elias implicitly now exchanging uneasy glances as they compared notes and discovered gaps, contradictions, and omissions that could no longer be explained away as coincidence. His name surfaced more frequently, sometimes spoken with confusion, sometimes with suspicion, and occasionally with an anger sharpened by the realization that their power had depended far more on him than they had ever admitted. Elias sensed this shift instinctively and altered his movements again, abandoning familiar paths, reducing his visibility to almost nothing, becoming less a participant and more a witness to the chaos he had helped unleash. The enslaved quarters buzzed with quiet speculation, stories traveling faster than Elias ever could, rumors of owners fighting among themselves, of debts surfacing, of families packing belongings under cover of night, and while fear remained, it was now braided with something more volatile: anticipation. Elias understood that anticipation could be as dangerous as despair, because hope without structure of 10 invited reckless acts, and he found himself intervening when he could, urging patience, reminding those who trusted him that confusion among the powerful did not automatically translate into safety for the powerless. At the same time, he felt the tightening net around his own existence, the way guards lingered longer at gates, how overseers asked questions they had never bothered with before, and how his passes were inspected as if the paper itself might betray him. The masters, sensing their vulnerability, sought reassurance through domination, increasing patrols and punishments, and Elias watched with a heavy, conflicted heart as innocent people suffered for a breakdown they had not caused, knowing that this cruelty was the system's final reflex, a desperate attempt to reassert control through pain. One evening, a summons arrived that Elias had long anticipated yet still dreaded, a request, thinly veiled as an order, for him to appear at a gathering of plantation owners who claimed they needed his services urgently. He recognized the trap immediately, understanding that such a meeting could mean interrogation, confinement, or worse, yet refusal would confirm their suspicions just as surely. Preparing for this moment, Elias weighed his options not in terms of survival alone, but in terms of consequence, asking himself whether vanishing would preserve what little momentum existed or allow the system to close ranks and recover. He chose to go, not out of bravado, but because presence, he knew, could still exert pressure in ways absence no longer could. The meeting took place in a grand house that had once welcomed him freely, its chandeliers blazing as if light itself could dispel the unease hanging in the room, and Elias entered to find faces etched with exhaustion and resentment, men who had lost money, reputation, and certainty in a matter of weeks. They questioned him carefully at first, their tone polite but strained, probing for explanations that would restore order without forcing self-examination, and Elias responded with measured truth, neither lying nor volunteering more than was asked, allowing their questions to circle without landing. As the conversation stretched on, frustration mounted, and the veneer of civility cracked, accusations surfacing that revealed just how dependent they had been on the very channels of secrecy now failing them. Elias listened as they spoke over one another, each man convinced that another had betrayed him, and in that moment he realized that the destruction of their unity was complete. Even if Elias were removed entirely, the trust that had bound them was gone. When they finally dismissed him, unsatisfied and unsettled, Elias walked back into the night with a clarity that bordered on calm, knowing that the confrontation he feared had already happened, not in violence, but in exposure. The days that followed were marked by rapid, visible decline, properties seized, families relocating, once proud men reduced to frantic bargaining, and the ripple effects spreading outward to every corner of the region. Elias remained on the margins, his role now passive yet profound, as the system collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Still, danger lingered, because collapsing systems often seek scapegoats, and Elias knew that his survival depended on staying just beyond the reach of desperation. He prepared for departure without announcing it, securing provisions, memorizing routes, and entrusting fragments of knowledge to others, so that no single loss could restore silence. On his final nights among the plantations, Elias moved not as a messenger but as a quiet witness, observing the last gasps of an order that had relied on his invisibility to function, and he felt no triumph, only a solemn understanding that what he had done was irreversible. The world he was leaving behind would not immediately become just or humane, but it would never again be stable in the way it once had been. And that instability, he believed, was the first crack through which change might eventually force its way. As he stood at the edge of the territory that had defined his life, listening to distant arguments echoing through houses that no longer felt secure, Elias understood that his story was no longer about access or secrecy, but about refusal, about the power of stepping out of a role so essential that its absence exposed the lie beneath the entire structure, and with that realization guiding him forward, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a world that would spend years unraveling the consequences of having underestimated the man who once moved freely through their nights. In the weeks after Elias vanished from the plantations, the absence he left behind grew louder than any rebellion could have been, a hollow space that demanded explanation, yet resisted closure. And the men who once ruled the nights found themselves awake until dawn, haunted not by ghosts but by logistics, by unanswered questions, by the realization that the invisible architecture of their power had depended on a single figure they never bothered to understand. Messages went undelivered, arrangements stalled, debts resurfaced without warning, and the informal understandings that had kept violence contained within predictable boundaries dissolved into mistrust and overreaction, as plantation owners who once relied on discretion now reached for brute force, exposing themselves to scrutiny they had long avoided. Elias, moving beyond the edges of the world that had defined him, felt this unraveling like distant thunder, not through news but through pattern, through the knowledge that systems do not recover quickly from the loss of a keystone, especially when that keystone carried memory, timing, and consent all at once. He traveled at night still, out of habit more than necessity, but the darkness felt different now, less like a tool and more like a witness, and as he passed through unfamiliar lands, he reflected on the strange truth that his greatest act of resistance had not been defiance but withdrawal, not sabotage but silence, a refusal to continue smoothing the pathways of exploitation. Behind him, the plantations struggled to adapt, appointing replacements who lacked Elias's intimate knowledge and quiet authority, men who tried to impose order through surveillance and punishment, only to discover that fear could not replicate trust, and that information coerced arrived too late or too distorted to be useful. Enslaved people, sensing the shift, began to navigate their own lives with cautious recalibration, some suffering under harsher regimes, others finding small openings where confusion created neglect, and while no liberation followed immediately, the illusion of inevitability cracked, revealing that the master's control had always been more fragile than it appeared. Elias carried with him the weight of these consequences, neither celebrating nor regretting them outright. because he understood that history rarely offers clean resolutions, only trajectories altered by human choice, and his choice had been to stop being the connective tissue of a system that thrived on invisibility. As months passed, stories began to circulate, whispered accounts of a man who could once enter any house at night, whose movements had stitched together an empire of secrecy, and whose disappearance had marked the beginning of its decline. And though the details varied wildly, the essence remained. Power had depended on someone it refused to acknowledge, and when that person stepped away, the truth became unavoidable. Elias himself avoided such legends, choosing anonymity over recognition, because survival still demanded caution, and because he believed that the lesson mattered more than the man, that others might recognize in their own lives the leverage hidden within roles they were told were insignificant. He settled eventually in a place where his past could not easily follow, working quietly, observing again, but with a crucial difference: he no longer mistook access for obligation, nor silence for safety, and he remained alert to the ways systems recruit the marginalized into sustaining their own oppression through routine and necessity. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of night, he remembered the plantations, the houses lit from within, the corridors he once walked without question, and he felt a complicated grief for the version of himself who survived by being useful to those who would never grant him humanity. Yet he also felt a steady resolve, knowing that usefulness without dignity is another form of captivity. The world he left behind did not collapse overnight, but it never fully healed either, limping forward under the strain of exposed contradictions, and years later, when descendants would argue over records, property, and blame, they would never quite grasp how much had hinged on one man's quiet refusal. And now, as this story reaches its end, remember this: history often teaches us to look for revolutions in fires and speeches, but sometimes the most devastating change begins when someone simply stops holding everything together. If this story kept you listening, if it made you think about power, silence, and the unseen hands that shape the world, then subscribe to Born into Darkness. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next descent into history's shadows, and leave a comment telling me how powerful this story felt to you, because these forgotten truths only stay alive when we're willing to confront them, even in the dark.